Just wanted to thank you for joining our space forum this evening. My name is Bert Dicht. I'm Vice President of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, I'd like to welcome you to our NSS Space Forum, New Perspectives on Filling the Gaps in Space to Support Future Communities in Space. And I'll talk more about the program tonight in just a second as I introduce our moderator. As always, I'd like to welcome you to the Space Forum. Again, this is a part of a series that we've been doing since last year, and we're down to now a every 2-week schedule, and we'll be working to put a long-term schedule together so we can share that with you, and hopefully you'll be able to take part in as many as possible. As always, I'd like to just discuss the virtual etiquettes. When you are submitting a question, we encourage you to use the Q&A function. That's only seen by the panelists, and it's much easier to pick out the questions. If you put them into the chat, they can get lost with all the other comments and things that are in the chat, and it's harder to find the question. So please try to use the Q&A function. Also, if you do use the chat, that's seen by others. So I encourage you to be respectful of the panelists and all of the audience. And I also encourage you, if you are viewing this, if you're a first-time user to Zoom, view the session in speaker mode. So that way you'll see the person who is speaking actually take up over the screen. We will be getting to a lot of the questions that were submitted. You, as always, you submit a number of great questions, and we do hope to get a number of questions as we go through the session and come directly from you, the audience. So we look forward to a really engaging and fun time with all the questions. In terms of what our agenda is, I'd just like to start off with some announcements very quickly. Some upcoming events, including the next Space Forum. We'll get into the presentation and the Q&A, and then we'll do a closeout and thank everybody and wait and see you for the next time. So let's just do the announcements. You probably know this all by heart for those of you who have joined us before. I encourage you to check out our NSS website, space.nss.org. There are a lot of new blogs up, a lot of new press releases related to all the things that are happening in space right now. So I encourage you to take a look. We're putting new content in every day. Also, we have inside.nss.org. That is our membership portal. So you have to be a member in order to get in, and a lot of great functionality to help you take control of your membership. Check out our YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter sites. Again, we're posting and making sure we have a lot of interesting and relevant content for all of you on all of these sites. Also, again, if you really are supportive of what we're doing, and we know you are because you're members, but if you're enjoying these programs like this, I encourage you to make a donation to support NSS. I'll post this URL into the chat. We've gotten people who've donated over the course of our programming, and we thank you for doing everything you can to support our mission and to support programs like this. So again, I'll thank you in advance for that. And also, I do encourage you to take the post-Space Forum survey. It only takes a few minutes, it's anonymous, and it really helps us in terms of doing program planning and seeing how we can improve this type of programs for you. So let's just talk about what's coming up with our Space Forums. And one of the great things, I mean, we saw today that the helicopter flew again on Mars. There's another flight tomorrow from Crew 2. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in space. But what's also exciting is the next generation of space professionals. And you're going to hear from that a group of talented I should say law students tonight. But coming up in the next session on May 6th, we have a group of aerospace professionals, early career aerospace professionals. Chantel Beyer, our NSS Board of Directors member, is going to be moderating, and we've got a space evangelist and STEM teacher. We've got a faculty member, an associate professor of aerospace engineering, and 3 engineers from Whisk Aero, from Boeing Defense, Space and Security, and also SpaceX. So they'll be sharing some very interesting perspectives on what it's like to be an aerospace professional today and where the profession is going and how they're going to help us advance our mission for NSS. And I'd encourage you to participate in 2 weeks. We'll be sending out an invite for that. But coming up after that, we have a presentation on the 20th on the space elevators. We're working to get our June 3rd one arranged, so you'll be hearing more about that. And I don't know yet, we're still working on the virtual ISDC. You'll be hearing more about that. So I would consider those dates all tentative, but just check out our website. We've got all the recordings from, or most of the recordings from previous space forums and town halls that you can find there, and we'll be putting the schedule in as well. So I encourage you to just take a look and participate in all of our future upcoming events. So tonight, it's my pleasure now to introduce, she's the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law, and our NSS president, my colleague, Michelle Hanlon, who is going to be introducing and moderating our session for tonight. So Michelle, it is all yours. Oh, Michelle, you're on mute.
Yeah, of course. I teach on Zoom, and I start every class the same way. We can't hear you, Professor. So first of all, let me thank you and Bert, and Dave and Fred and Larry for all of your support in putting this together. You guys are amazing, and you do it every 2 weeks, and the program looks phenomenal. Next week for sure. I mean, all your programs look phenomenal, but definitely May 6th is on my calendar. I want to say happy Earth Day to everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I am really so proud to be the president of the National Space Society. I have seen so much good and incredible projects and things come out of the National Space Society. It's just been a real honor to be affiliated with it. And I'm really hoping, to be able to host a lot of sessions like this where we can just have discussions about space and policy, which of course are my specialties, space law and policy, which of course are my specialties. So I can barely talk, so I'm going to let my students do the talking. I'm going to share my screen. I want to again thank everybody for being here. And I see that we have at least people from as far away as Hawaii and India. So thank you for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk about new perspectives on filling the gaps in space law to support future communities in space. And so what does that really mean? I'm going to just give you, put my professor hat on for a minute and talk about the law that we have. I'm sure many of you already know. We have been living under the Outer Space Law Treaty, that treaty regime, since 1967. The Outer Space Treaty is very simple. It provides principles and guidelines for the use of outer space. And it just has some very straightforward provisions: freedom of exploration and use, no appropriation by sovereignty or by any other means. So no nation may claim territory in space. All activities in space have to be undertaken in accordance with international law. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Astronauts are considered envoys of humankind and should be rescued if they are in distress. Nations have international responsibility for their nationals in space. We have a liability regime. If you do damage to somebody else in space, then you have to pay them. Anything that we send to space, a nation sends to space, remains the jurisdiction and in the jurisdiction and control the property of the nation that sent it. And the only sort of restriction we have on that first point, that freedom of exploration and use, is Article 9, which says you have to have due regard for the activities of others when you're in space. So this is our Magna Carta. This is our framework for all of the activities that we do in space. It's worked really well for 50 plus years to keep the peace in space. What could possibly go wrong now, right? want to introduce my panel, which you can, and I think, see only slowly before we get into it. Each individual is going to talk a little bit about a gap that they have identified in the law. Joining me are AJ Link, who is an LLM student here at the University of Mississippi, doing a lot of incredible work here, looking at human rights and law, working on inclusion and diversity in aerospace. Bailey Cunningham is the chair of my new NSS President's Legal Council. She is a law student. She is soon to be a law graduate from Florida State. Sam Thorpe and Christiana Paissios and Laura Brady are all students at the University of Mississippi. And Laura herself is also graduating soon. So to our new graduates, congratulations. We're delighted that you were able to spend some time with us as you get ready for your graduation and make it through finals. All of the students are still in finals. So thank you for joining us. And with that, I will stop talking and move us right along. So our first gap is going to be addressed by Sam Thorpe.
Let me get situated super quick. But hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you for joining us this evening. As I am going to go over the gap of where space actually begins in outer space or in airspace. So it's something that's been discussed for over 60 years at UN COPUOS. It is something that has never really been, described and figured out what exactly it is. There's no general consensus on it. It's not been defined in either the Outer Space Treaty or, airspace in outer space haven't even been defined in the airspace realm. So why should we care about this? Why is outer space why is it finding out where exactly outer space is? It's just up there, right? No, it's something that is going to impact all of space law. When you decide where outer space begins and where airspace ends, you're getting rid of things such as territorial sovereignty that is given by the Chicago Convention, and you're going into this place of free exploration and free use, as Professor Hanlon just went over. So, when you are deciding where outer space begins and where airspace ends, you're also deciding what's an aircraft and what's a spacecraft. So when you are, I'm sorry, I have to pause for a second. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but outer space is free use. So correct. So it's going to be differentiated exactly from airspace and where airspace begins. And the different approaches we have are, a functionalist approach, a spatialist approach, and a wait and see approach. These are different approaches that will really describe to us how to get to what outer space is and what it isn't. But the spatialist approach is this approach that 100 kilometers above the airspace is where we begin to reach outer space. And it really has these issues of when we get there, it doesn't, that's where aircraft stop moving. That's where the approach to airspace is, and you can't get aerodynamic lift. But with regard to the functionalist approach, which is the second approach that has been generally identified, and I'm sorry, I see some questions in the chat. But so the functionalist approach describes the effect of what you're doing is how you are going to be defined as an aircraft or a spacecraft. And again, the reason this is so important is because the air law and the space law are very drastically different. You have international law that hits you in outer space as opposed to airspace, which is you can generally be under someone's territorial sovereignty or other international laws depending upon where you are. But the wait and see approach has told us that if you decide now, you're going to hinder innovation. You're going to start hitting the international law at a point where you're going to be going ahead of what technology is actually doing. And once technology gets there, you're not going to be able to have an effective environment, and you're going to hinder innovation. So what are possible solutions to this? The possible solution that I propose is it's all three going together. You want to have just a pure spatialist approach. You don't want to have a pure functionalist approach, and you don't want to just wait and let everyone pass you by. So what I propose is a spatialist approach with regard to overflight and making sure that you're not going to launch a rocket over someone else's territory and potentially hinder, you're not going to potentially have liability issues. A functionalist approach with regard to getting into space and defining when you're doing space activities, when you're doing air activities, but also a wait and see, because we are not at the point yet to where we can really justify what we have, what is going to be happening in outer space in the next couple of years. Our technology just simply isn't there. So when you put all these three together, it's really imperative to understand that the spatialist approach is going to be defining where space is. And eventually, when we realize what that is, we will have a very robust regime, but we're not there yet. And we need to be licensing things under our national territory functionally to really be able to go into outer space and say, we're not going to crash into somebody else's airspace, and we're not going to be in somebody else's airspace. So that's my gap. I know it's a little muddled, but the airspace and outer space regime is something that's really near and dear to my heart, and I would love to take questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Sam. So we're going to take questions at the end. I just want to say, that well done, and I think people really don't really recognize that even though we have this treaty regime, that treaty regime doesn't even identify what space is. So we really, even though we have had this regime for 50 plus years, there are so many gaps, and even very fundamental gaps. And just to respond to one of the questions, because I should have done this before, the Outer Space Treaty that we're talking about has been ratified by most spacefaring nations, including the United States, Russia, and China. So there's 104 signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. And so it's really, a lot of the provisions of it have become considered customary international law. But again, still a lot of gaps, including where does space begin? Thank you, Sam. Now we're going to go on to Christiana, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the commercial space. And so what we're seeing now, right, is things are very different today from what they were like when the Outer Space Treaty was being negotiated. And so Christiana is going to fill us in on a little bit on that and how we're going to be able to address that.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for everyone that is here tonight. I'm so honored to be here. Yes, my gap is about commercialization. So the Outer Space Treaty leaves a gap in the law because it does not directly address the rights, the responsibilities, or the concerns of private commercial actors. At the time that the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated and drafted, private actors were not included in the international treaty. I'm sorry. While Articles 6, 8, and 9 do allude to private actors, there are not any clear definitions upon which to act. So under Article 6, states bear the responsibility for the actions of non-governmental agencies. This means that private actors are the responsibility of their states. And it's further clarified in Article 8, where it states that a state party shall retain jurisdiction and control over objects launched on their state registry. And last, and most importantly, Article 9 states that state parties, and therefore their non-governmental actors, must act with due regard to the corresponding interests of all of their state parties to the treaty. So this lack of clarity and definition, specifically in Article 9, alludes to an interpretation of law that without a second actor upon whom the first actor must give this due regard, there are a few limitations. The Outer Space Treaty provides guidelines that relate to preserving peace, international collaboration, and freedom between all the actors. And this gap leads to disputes in understanding and application. And these disputes in understanding and application will lead to disputes over actions, rights, and the potential liabilities of everyone involved. So this gap in the law suggests an interpretation of due regard, and this means that current states and private commercial actors must navigate great uncertainty in how their actions will be perceived. And this can even strain and inhibit state actors' willingness in how they're going to move forward with private actors in future space endeavors. This legal uncertainty inhibits the exploration and innovation that private actors can provide, and it leaves states on uncertain footing on how to proceed. And so from there, this gap in the law suggests that these commercial actors are subject to reactive analysis, where the laws and guidelines will be addressed after these conflicts have occurred or after something has occurred, rather than proactive guidelines that can be implemented now and that will address private actors' current concerns as they begin developing and exploring and reaching out more. So each conflict and alleged breach could result in a different outcome, and this ambiguity will only grow over time and result in more disputes. And the gap is not an abstract issue that only exists in the future, as we can see. Private actors are making moves into space, and the concerns of space debris, heritage preservation, and the liability that will result from a growing population in space need to be addressed now. The way to address this gap and create a more stable framework for private commercial actors is to create clear expectations of behavior and a clear delimitation of their respective rights. And so state actors will not be the only primary actors in space for much longer, and those operating in space need to have this clarity. If private commercial actors are to be held liable, they need to have a say in the legal framework that needs to emerge in coming years. Whether this is through multilateral agreements, new provisions to the Outer Space Treaty, being recognized as permanent observers, or through international recognition of private commercial actors as independent actors, private actors need to be contributing members to the discussion. Current space law does not properly address the challenges that will arise as more private commercial companies begin operating in space. Without clarity, these companies will act within the laws of their own countries and under the broad, ambiguous spectrum of behavior that the Outer Space Treaty has outlined. There needs to be international standards that all actors can look to for guidance and for understanding of acceptable behavior. For these reasons, we must fill this gap. It will incentivize greater cooperation between private commercial actors and their ideas and concerns and the goals for the future of space that will be taken into consideration and help shape the economic growth of space. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Christiana. I love to talk about this commercial space, and there's this huge misnomer out there that lawyers love regulation, and that we're just out there to tamp down business and stunt growth. When in actuality, lawyers love life without regulation because that brings more litigation, right? And so this gap with respect to commercial space means our young companies, our nascent space entrepreneurs are going to be spending a lot more money on the likes of people like us litigating than they are on the what they should be spending on the research they need to be able to explore and utilize space resources. I know we're going to have a lot of questions on this topic, but we're going to again take questions at the end. Thank you very much, Christiana. Now we're going to move on, and this sounds great, right? It's all rosy. We don't really know where space begins. But we do know we have a lot of commercial space, and that's really good news because we want to get humans exploring and humans expanding into space. But there is another gap that Laura Brady is going to tell us about.
Hi, thank you for having me tonight. Excuse me. The gap I would like to talk about has to do with one of our fastest growing concerns in space, and that is space debris. There are currently over 6,200 satellites in space, 3,800 of which are no longer functioning. So they're just floating around, not being very productive. And with new technology, these satellites are becoming smaller and less expensive. So we're getting more and more and more of them. In fact, the US already has applications filed with the FCC and the ITU to put an additional 57,000 space objects in space by 2029. And this is a problem, not only because it is creating pollution and blocking our views of space, but also because space is not limited. The more crowded it gets, the more dangerous it becomes for expensive space technology, as well as for humans in space and on Earth. As of 2019, it's estimated there are more than 2.2 million pieces of fragmented debris in orbit and around the Earth that can travel at speeds almost 7 times faster than a bullet. That is a lot of stuff moving very quickly in space. And something as small as a paint chip can cause extreme damage to space objects. So we have to do something to mitigate and remove this debris in order to protect our environment, technology, people, and future. The gap in the Outer Space Treaty regarding space debris makes the removal of space debris very difficult, and it comes down to 2 very intertwined issues. As Christiana talked about, there's a lack of clear and applicable definitions in the Outer Space Treaty. And this is no different with space debris. This lack of definition in conjunction with the legal status of space debris laid out in the Outer Space Treaty creates a gap, or in this case, maybe even more of a barrier to the removal of space debris. Historically, the term space debris has covered natural debris in space, but for this conversation, we're going to focus on man-made debris, which includes any objects. For this conversation, it's going to include any objects floating in space, including the pieces broken off of larger space objects. So the Outer Space Treaty attaches liability to launching states and permanently binds an object to the state in which it is registered. And this also includes any commercial space objects, as I mentioned in the last presentation. This means objects in space cannot be touched by anyone other than the registered state without permission. This limits the ability to remove objects to just the registered states. That means we cannot go and retrieve objects that are floating around that do not belong or are not registered to the US. So even if we want to go and help solve this issue of debris, we cannot do it alone. And even if states want to give permission to other states to remove their debris, liability is still a major concern. Trying to remove debris flying through space at incredible speeds can be tricky and dangerous. If there's an accident during removal, who is liable? Contractually, a launching state can assign liability to a removal company, but through the Outer Space Treaty, this liability is joint and several. This means that any state that is negatively impacted by an accident could also sue the launching state. And they're very likely to do so because more than likely, a launching state's gonna have deeper pockets than the debris removal company. So even contractually trying to allow companies to go and handle this situation is still gonna cause a lot of liability issues on each launching state. And this leads to the other gap in the law, the definition of space debris. The phrase space debris is not in the Outer Space Treaty. The phrase objects launched into space is as close as we get. So what about broken off pieces of an old satellite? What most people think of when we say space debris. Can a company remove this without permission? Who is liable if it causes a collision? Article 8 does include the phrase component parts in its definition. And so while we don't know how liability will work for items unable to be identified, it is safe to say even debris, even small pieces of debris are attributable to launching states. Finding an international solution to space debris removal would be the most beneficial approach. The cost and development of technology, as well as an employment of that technology, could be spread amongst launching states. Beyond the legal complexities involved in space debris removal, the biggest roadblock is getting state and space community on board. Internationally, we can lower the price by working together. States will be more proactive in space debris removal once we get costs down. Domestically, we can use tax incentives, technology development grants, and other financial incentives to get people on board. However, I believe the biggest incentive is education. Money talks, and space technology is expensive. Both state and commercial actors who want to protect the expensive technology they are launching into space will be more likely to be on board for debris removal once they understand how prevalent and dangerous space debris is to their property. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, space debris, I mean, and what we're really thinking about, we're sort of wrapping up all of these concepts together in terms of these gaps because they all relate to each other, right? You know, where does space begin? When do we have to start worrying about cleanup? The increasing commercial activity is going to create more debris. How are we going to regulate that? What kind of thoughts, what kind of things should we do to promote commercial activity while also dealing with this debris, this orbital debris? I just need to respond to my colleague, Jeffrey Liss. We lawyers are not all litigators, and I assure you, we're not out here hoping that we get your business and end up in court for 40 years. We're actually, the space lawyers, for the most part, are here because we want to create that certainty. We want to create the regulations that will help companies be able to invest in their own R&D, and we want to be able to help figure out the guardrails and not have sort of heavy regulation. This isn't a, okay, nobody else can launch a satellite because then we're going to create more orbital debris kind of regulation. This is, okay, we have a problem, let's figure out a way to deal with it in a way that will not hinder innovation and advancement. So as we talk about advancement, the next topic is obviously very near and dear to my heart. Those of you who know me know I'm also the co-founder of For All Mankind, which is the only organization in the world dedicated to protecting human heritage in outer space. Bailey Cunningham is going to tell us why there's a gap that we need to fill.
Thank you very much. Here on Earth, we have gone to great lengths to recognize and protect our common human heritage, with over 1,000 sites protected under the World Heritage Convention. Human heritage in space, however, remains unprotected and at risk of being lost. Over 6 decades ago, the international community negotiated a set of treaties and conventions, and at the time, the preservation of cultural heritage in outer space was not a concern. As such, it is not surprising that the Outer Space Treaty, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Rescue and Return Agreement are all silent with respect to the preservation and protection of human cultural heritage. In 1959, the first human-made object, Luna 2, reached the lunar surface. 10 years later, Apollo 11 landed in the Sea of Tranquility, and humanity took its first extraterrestrial steps. Each of Apollo lunar landing sites and the robotic sites that preceded and followed are evidence of humanity's unparalleled achievements. Objects left behind on the lunar surface, along with the infamous boot prints, have been undisturbed for nearly 6 decades. They have been preserved by the vacuum of space, untouched by humans since 1972. However, the moon is about to get crowded. India, Japan, China, Russia, Korea, and the United States, among others, will have lunar surface missions within the next decade. Numerous private companies also have missions planned within the next 5 years, including SpaceX, Astrobotic, Blue Origin, and Space.il. With the influx of traffic to the lunar surface, there are several hazards and challenges that will arise. While it is not to be suggested that private companies or nations would intentionally desecrate historic sites on the moon, it is unreasonable to ignore that there are no enforceable laws to prevent the harming or destruction of these objects and sites. We have the opportunity to protect these sites before humans return to the moon once more. There are numerous complex legal issues which arise in regards to heritage in space, and there is much that has been left unanswered. Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty is clear that objects in space remain under the jurisdiction, ownership, and control of the state that was responsible for putting them there. But the treaty offers no further protection. While other states will be responsible for any damage done to such objects, there are several details left unclear. First, what kind of damage can be claimed to have occurred in respect to an object that is non-operational? Second, even if damage is recognized, how would the value or extent of this damage be quantified? If a state or its national damages the Apollo 11 lunar module, for instance, what would restitution look like? From a historical perspective, the lunar module is a priceless artifact. However, it is simply a piece of equipment serving no current function. It is unclear what the cost would be should these sites get damaged or destroyed, and how these values would be calculated. Further, Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty requires all activities in space be conducted with due regard to the corresponding interest of all other state parties, which suggests that other states should not interfere with the objects of another. However, due regard has no legal definition, and it is unclear what due regard would look like in this context, especially in regards to non-operational objects. Importantly, too, these treaties deal with objects, not the sites themselves or the features of the site, like the boot prints. While the path to the protection and preservation of human heritage in space is not easy, there are several viable options for the international community to consider. NASA has previously offered guidelines on how to protect and preserve U.S. lunar artifacts. These guidelines cover only U.S. artifacts and U.S. sites and pertain only to the moon. Moreover, these guidelines are recommendations only. They are not enforceable laws. NASA again emphasized the protection of heritage in the Artemis Accords. While the Artemis Accords are not binding and are simply principles, they serve as a framework for cooperative agreements in which NASA and its partner states will commit to the protection of sites and artifacts with historic value. While these guidelines and cooperative agreements have the potential to implement some protections for certain artifacts, many objects would still remain at risk. Thus, the international community could fill in the gap by adopting new provisions in the form of a resolution. Such a resolution should establish an effective system of collective protection of cultural heritage of outstanding universal value, organized on a permanent basis and in accordance with modern scientific methods. It is important to note that the idea here is not to stifle exploration, but to preserve for future and present generations those sites that meet certain agreed upon criteria. Currently, there are more than 100 historic sites on the moon. These sites represent moments that have changed and advanced our human civilization. Our moon alone hosts the remnants of humanity's greatest technological achievement to date, yet no law protects humanity's common heritage on the lunar surface. These gaps that exist in the law present a unique opportunity for the international community to forge a regime in which common human heritage in space is recognized and protected for future generations to come.
Thank you, Bailey. And so I think this shows really well how gaps can be problematic in space, but they can also provide opportunity in space. And so when we think about protecting human heritage in space, we're really not just talking about, we need to protect the hardware that's up there, but really we need to talk about how we're going to explore and what we need to do to keep that exploration sustainable, and how we're going to preserve our culture and indeed our humanity as we explore. Obviously, this is something in 1967, the negotiators of the Outer Space Treaty were hardly thinking of heritage because we hadn't even reached the moon yet. Well, the Luna 2 had reached the moon, but there wasn't a lot of stuff up there just yet. Thank you very much, Bailey. And now we're going to turn to our last presenter. AJ is going to talk about perhaps one of the biggest gaps in the Outer Space Treaty having to do with human rights protections.
Hey y'all, thank you so much. This is AJ speaking. Real quickly, I have on a black and green hat and a black hoodie, and I'm sitting in an airport. I'm a black male, I use he, him pronouns, and I have a beard. My slide is black with white text, and now that we have all of that out of the way, I will talk about it. I'm so sorry that we don't have captions for those who need it, but hopefully we will next time. I think Bailey did a good job talking about cultural heritage, and I think tying that into human rights is really important. There are several human rights treaties that already do that. I'm so sorry, I'm in an airport if you can hear the PA. The UN Charter, the UDHR, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights all talk about the idea of cultural heritage, right? And I think that's really important. There's also a UN resolution that talks about cultural rights and the protection of cultural heritage. But as we expand this idea into other forms of human rights, there aren't real solid legal protections, right? So the Outer Space Treaty says that international law applies in Article 1. But then in Article 2, it says that you can't have sovereignty, which is a really big issue in terms of how international human rights operates currently in the state-based system, right? So you can have personal jurisdiction, but it's really hard to imagine a human rights system as it currently is. When you talk about non-appropriation in space, what does that look like? There have been several questions about potential long-term cities and things like that on celestial bodies, and I do believe there's a question about who gets to govern them, right? I think when you talk again about human rights, the right to self-determination and for people to choose their own political system is huge, right? And how are we going to kind of navigate this? Outside of political rights, when you think about cultural rights beyond heritage rights, like the right to the language, the right to be part of a certain group of people, how do we enforce this in the really treacherous realm of space, right? Space is not an easy place to be currently, right? It's not what we're used to as human beings. And so we have to incorporate this idea of progressive realization that we use in human rights. Sorry if I'm talking too fast, but there are examples, right? There are things that we can look to, like the non-discrimination code and the ISS Code of Conduct. This is a very, very small piece, and it's not a huge section in the Code of Conduct, at least in the U.S. National Space Association, but this also only applies to astronauts, right? And folks going up on the ISS. Not all spaceflight participants or people participating in space outside of the International Space Station. So there's this huge gap as we look towards the future, and this is obviously a long ways off, and I get the critique of some folks saying we should focus more on things that are happening now and currently, and I think my co-panelists did a wonderful job talking about really current tangible issues that are going on in space. But I think this gap is really unique, and that we have a lot of time to fill it before we get to a point where there's a lot of issues. And so I believe outer space provides us an opportunity to get things less wrong, because we all know our current international human rights system, for all the good things that it does, is still really, really flawed. And in terms of solutions, I know Sam proposed solutions for his gap. I think there are two kind of approaches, right? The first one is something that the Just Add Astra project, which is a wonderful space law project that I'm part of, is working towards, where you adapt certain rights to outer space, right? So the right to water is already a terrestrial human right, but how do we adapt that to outer space and what goes into that? Or the right to a breathable atmosphere and a habitable environment. How do we kind of manipulate and change those current laws into a way that fits into space? And then the second approach is something that I personally favor, and it's creating a new system, right? Not necessarily from scratch, but taking the lessons that we've learned here about what works and doesn't work, and forming a new human rights system that's very inclusive, very protective, and potentially not necessarily state-centered, right? So in the current international system, like I said, it oftentimes takes a state to bring a claim for one of its citizens that has a grievance, one of its citizens that have a grievance. But then you kind of get into statelessness, right? And how do you get stateless people and their rights enforced, which is a really interesting terrestrial issue. And so I think the gap isn't necessarily bothersome right now. It's not a huge issue right now, but it is there. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity to kind of work on that and explore better ways to fill it than what we've done currently. And I think I've saved enough time for questions. So I'm sorry if I spoke fast. I tend to do that, but I wanted to make sure we could get to everyone's questions. This is AJ. I'm done speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. I'm actually going to throw it back at you because we had a lot of questions in the run up to this presentation, and we are getting a few questions in the chat and the Q&A about how do you adjudicate things that happened in space? You know, what court do you go to today if somebody is harmed in space? Let's just say the two satellites collide, or like how do people handle disputes about space right now?
Because international law applies, right, there are several mechanisms, right? There's international arbitration, there's the ICJ if it's something that's truly criminal. I can't imagine that happening just yet. But I think currently there is a framework where you can at least attempt to have your disputes resolved. I think about Cosmos 954. I answered someone's question earlier about that, where Canada didn't get everything they asked for, right? But they did get at least some type of restitution or compensation. As we look further out, and this is something that I'm really interested in right now, is how do we deliver justice terrestrially to folks who maybe really are far away from these things, right? If you're long-term inhabiting the moon or another celestial body, which court do you go to? Which judicial body can enforce your rights? I think that's really scary, especially when you start to think about workers' rights and, you know, a potential bad actor as an employer cutting off someone's oxygen or water or something like that. How do you get recourse? I think that's a really interesting question. But for right now, there are ways to get disputes handled terrestrially.
Thank you, AJ. And I appreciate you talking fast and beating the announcement. That's well answered. And I think it's, you know, again, AJ said it really well. You know, it feels like it's a very distant thing to worry about. But, you know, when we talk about the mission of the National Space Society is to create those communities beyond Earth, communities in space, and to figure out how those communities are going to succeed. And thinking about the rights of the people in those communities is something we have to start right away. I'm just going to, obviously encourage everybody to become a member of NSS. I will stop sharing so we can see people larger now. But when we think about creating human communities in space, we have to get to space. So Laura, we had a bunch of questions about orbital debris, both in the Q&A and from before. So if you can just, I'm going to sort of throw 2 or 3 concepts at you. You know, when can you claim salvage rights on space objects? You know, and how can orbital debris be controlled if you're not attaching liability for dead objects? And do you think an emerging space company, an ADR company, active debris removal, can really make a change? And what kind of regulations do we need to see that happen?
Absolutely. So those are some great questions. I love the question about can you salvage things in space, because this is something that's discussed a lot. And as of right now, salvage rights can't be attached to space objects. And that comes from our Outer Space Treaty and the issues I talked about with liability and jurisdiction staying with who it starts with from the beginning. We don't have a process now through the law that allows us to get rid of that liability and to transfer that a jurisdiction. And so this really highlights one of the reasons space debris removal is an issue. It's really difficult to implement because of this. So a lot of people point to maritime law when we talk about space law, because very similar concepts, use, you know, kind of international use, everyone uses it. And so a lot of times that's where we go. Unfortunately, when it comes to maritime law and their salvage rights, it doesn't work for us. And again, that goes to the Outer Space Treaty and that need or that inability to separate liability and jurisdiction. So if something happens in the launching state at this point can always be held liable. And while that's the case, I don't see how we can really go forward with salvaging. I don't see states being feeling able to turn over rights when knowing that they could still be liable for those things. So salvaging is just not going to, unfortunately at this point, be an option. That being said, it would be an amazing thing. And I know that some of the things that have been talked about with space debris removal, if we can find a way to do this, that we could then recycle and reuse these materials, which again, great for the environment, helps get rid of the debris. So hopefully we're going to find a solution to that. But as the law is right now, it would be very difficult. And then when it comes to what would we do if there was no liability attached to that debris? That's the big question. If there is no liability, unfortunately, like we don't know right now, liability is attached to that debris. If we cannot pinpoint who it belongs to, we still don't, no one has the right to remove it without knowing who it belongs to. So it's so connected to the original registered and launching state that we can't separate that. And so I don't know that answer. What would we do if we could separate that? We would be open to a lot more options when it comes to removal and salvaging and things like that. And like I said before, there are options for treaties. There's options for us working together as states to try to give each other permission. However, it's not an easy process. It would be very complicated, again, because of that liability issue. And then when it comes to if we have space companies that are willing to go and do ADR, first off, that would be amazing. And I know there's a lot of companies that are working on that, and a lot of time and technology has been put into trying to find the best ways to do this. It would be great. However, I think there's also some negatives to it. So removing space debris is incredibly important and we need to do it. However, I could also see if we have a solution to just go up and remove it, I could see where this would maybe hamper the other side of space debris, which is space debris mitigation. So we're talking about removal, and we also have mitigation. And mitigation is what happens before. That's these regulations we're putting in place to prevent future stuff from happening or limiting the future debris that's going to happen. And I don't want, as much as I want space debris removal to become a very accessible thing, I don't want that to hamper our mitigation as well. So yes, I think that having space companies will change how we regulate space in general. So there's a trade-off. There's the cost of mitigation for the for the removal of mitigation versus the cost of having more regulations and requiring certain things of launching of people who are launching. So it's really going to be interesting to see how that plays out for sure.
Yeah, thank you. It is the debris. I mean, then there are a lot of people working on sort of trying to make an economy out of the debris using Bitcoin and smart contracts and trying to find a way to monetize the whole process. Wow, there are so many questions. I'm really excited, but you have to bear with me that I'm definitely not going to get to all of them. And I promise you though that we will respond to them in writing. So I think, Bert, if we can just make sure we save the Q&A in the chat, anything we don't get to, if we can create a document and put it on the website or up on our social media or something with all the answers. With that said, I'm going to go back to you, Christiana. A lot of concepts, with this commercial space, and we're talking about a treaty that doesn't necessarily bind commercial actors. If corporations and private individuals aren't included, do they have to follow international law? When you talk about it, also think about the fact that there are a lot of, when we talk about commercial entities, they're actually partnering with the governments right now. And should we create some sort of quasi rights for these private companies, or should they be treated differently than just a regular entity? Sort of if you could expand a little bit more on the comments you made regarding commercial space.
Sure. So I'm going to be honest, I might have lost a few of those. But first, definitely, I believe that commercial actors should be viewed as their own entities and as their own participants so that they can bring forward their issues. If we're asking them to be held liable and to be participating and to be contributing, they're going to have their own perspectives. Corporations have different views and different goals, and the truth is corporations are laboratories of innovation and entrepreneurship, and they think about things in a different way. And so their ability to pair with government actors is very helpful, I think, on both sides, because you have a lot of national interests and the growth and exploration, but then you also have the ability of what do people want, what are consumers interested, and there's always that fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. So it's going to be the most productive monetarily way to get something done. So you definitely want to be hearing from them and interacting with them, I believe, as this continues. And then the other part about, I'm so sorry, I think I missed your first part.
That's okay. I think you covered it. So I just get the what I was hoping you would say, and you did, is I coach you guys well. No, this is all them, not me at all. But I would love to take credit for all of these stars. The commercial space, when you think about the difference, somebody just put a question about customer international law. The difference now between 50 years ago is that private companies are doing things that only nations used to be able to do. So we really have to think about law very differently and regulation very differently. And we do have to accept that these commercial entities that are acting like nations, not just in space, but in cyberspace as well, right? They should have a seat at the table, and they should have a say in how these things, how these regulations are going to develop. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go now to Sam, and I know you talked about the delimitation of space, but I also know that you have done a lot of interesting research on lunar mining and sort of lunar property and resources on the moon. And there's a lot of questions about, hey, can I just, who's going to tell me that I can or can't go and pick a plot on the moon and mine it?
So it's a very interesting issue to me, because a lot of people, so we'll go with the first international framework for it. A lot of people cite Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and it's not appropriation principle. And then they cite, Article 6, which says that states are responsible for their non-governmental actors. And they use that to say that you can't appropriate territory at all in space. But then you have these same individuals that say, oh no, well, that's not exactly how it works. And you're basically using these two articles to do two completely different arguments. But back to your point. So you said, what's stopping me from going up there and mining the moon, correct? So basically it's just this confusion and ambiguity in outer space law with regard to whether or not you can mine the moon. The US has made great strides in this regard recently. They've said that, yeah, we don't agree with the moon agreement. We can go up there and do what we want. We can mine the moon whenever. But realistically, it's your domestic laws that you're going to have to register through. You're going to have to decide. You're going to have to discuss with the appropriate licensing authorities where you can and can't mine, and then they're going to have to report it to the UN. So realistically, if you have the money and you have the ability to get your license, you can go do it, but you have to adhere to the Outer Space Treaty. You have to adhere to your domestic laws, and you're going to have to get approval from your domestic laws, and which usually means you're going to have to get approval from the UN. But there's a little bit of a gray area with regard to mining there. So I hope that answers your question. But
yeah, no, and we debate the sort of property and the ability to the right to mine, the ability to mine all the time in our classes, because what does it mean? Article 2 says no sovereign may claim territory. No nation may claim territory by sovereignty or any other means. Does that mean private individuals can't? And does that mean you can't extract the resources? And of course, we have many different interpretations of that article going around. And I saw Wes Fairs, I know that you're out there, and it is in the Declaration of Human Rights that an individual can own property. And so what does that mean with respect to space? Bailey, I'm going to sort of go back and think about, we've talked about commercial expansion, and we've talked about mining the moon. You talked about heritage protection. Are there other things we should protect? Are there environmental laws? Are there things, conservation? Are there other things we ought to worry about on the moon, on other planets? Is there a difference? Thinking about that, that gap and how we're going to fill it, do you think that the international community is in a place where we can start to fill these gaps in a realistic manner?
Thank you. So to begin, Article 9 provides that we should be avoiding harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies. So going forward, our mission should be focused on a sustainable lunar trajectory and out to celestial bodies as well. So we should be looking to preserve the lunar environment as well as other celestial bodies. We should be looking to conserve and try to use our resources wisely. We didn't exactly think of that on Earth when we started out and started advancing. It wasn't a priority. So now we have the technology, we have the foresight to make the corrections in our actions and think before we actually go to the lunar surface and beyond, and maybe think a little bit more about the environment. And this could involve beyond planetary protection, more of conservation and thinking of, instead of inhibiting our exploration and the commercialization of space, perhaps just thinking of being more mindful towards others and the environment itself, so we can have a sustainable exploration of both these celestial bodies and space itself. And I think that will guide the future a little bit better than talking about regulations and restrictions and binding possible new treaties, because I think commercialization is much more open to being sustainable and being able to do these activities long term, rather than doing what we want now, not thinking of the consequences, and then ending up with a problem like we have on Earth now.
Yeah, thank you, Bailey. I couldn't agree more. And I'm just realizing, you know, I'm going to take these questions and I'm going to put them on my finals. I mean, they're all great. So maybe we shouldn't share them with the students. So AJ, I'm going to go back to you because this is an interesting question. I know you and I talk a lot about it. What type of social diversity should be included in a human community? We're not going to call them settlements or colonies, in a human community on the moon, and how are you going to what kind of social engineering should we be thinking about? Should we even be thinking about?
I think as much diversity as is allowable and possible in whatever particular environment we go to. I kind of talked about how space is a treacherous place, right? It's not the safest environment. So there's a real possibility that some folks won't be able to go. I know there was discussion I was having with someone the other day, kind of talking about, well, what about pregnancies in space and how does that affect people? And I think we should approach space from the starting point that everyone should have access to space, right? And then as we see problems and concerns, we whittle down from there. But I don't like the fact that for a long time it was always the same kind of people that we saw in space, right? I think the other day was Mae Jemison's birthday, maybe, or some holiday. And that's a really big deal, right? But I guess I'm sentimental and think it shouldn't be, right? We should have been well past that. And so I think we as a society have to really think about what we value and what we want our space cities, societies, whatever, to look like, and who we want to be included in those, and who we want to leave behind. I don't think that's an easy question to answer socially or technologically. I think it's just something we'll have to navigate, but always keep in the back of our minds as we're doing these things.
So it fascinates me that you say who gets left behind. So how many people on this panel would hop on that ship to Mars and start creating that community?
I go to the moon, not Mars.
So yeah, thank you. The question sort of, and we don't have a lot of time left, but this, what happens when major actors withdraw from the treaty regime? And so again, this is one of those questions like, and let's sort of, I want to couch it more in terms of, current events. And so tomorrow morning, Russia and China, tomorrow very early morning, are going to talk about their joint moon base, which many see as a reaction to Artemis. And so, Laura, what does, just now take off your law student hat and just react as a young person who wants to go to space, and now you're seeing Russia, China, and US.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. If we get rid of, I'm going to get rid of my legal hat, but before I do, I'm going to quickly say that even if we kind of get away from the treaty part of it, and of course they did not join the Artemis Accords, and so they're not in that treaty, there's a lot of argument that ownership of or sovereignty of celestial bodies is part of customary international law. So there is still some protections there legally. Now, if I take off my legal hat and I just think what would happen, I think that's why I enjoy parts of the Artemis Accords. It is set up to provide cooperation and working together and trying to figure out how we can all use space. One of the things I love about space is how we've been able to create and make it free for all. Now, that being said, not very many states have been spacefaring states for many, many years, and we're going to see, more and more over the years. But that's one of the things I love about space. And of course, it's not perfect, but overall, we haven't done a terrible job as a planet in keeping space free for exploration and use for all. So I think the most important thing that we can do, and other countries who have joined the Artemis Accords and other countries who may feel threatened by Russia and China's move, is that we need to make sure we're doing our part. All we can do is make sure that we keep developing our own space technology and pushing that we are developing a strong space economy, and that we model how states can cooperate and work together. That's the only way we can do it, is setting that precedent by showing what could and what should be done.
Thank you. And Bailey, I'm going to go to you and sort of build on what Laura said. And this, we talk about this concept of universalization. Can it happen with countries still so divided here on Earth?
I'm definitely skeptical. I think that it'll be much easier for us to create cooperative agreements and work together rather than just have one overarching rule or regulation for the governance, especially for the lunar surface. I think we're for sure going to start out with our separate laws working together. And I think as we move forward and make those multilateral agreements, there'll be an easier way forward. I think countries will start to see that we have common goals, and we don't have to be the same, but we can work towards the same goals.
Yeah, perfect. So Christiana, I'm going to let you close out the panel with your thoughts on, Russia, China, geopolitics. Again, take off the lawyer hat and just as a student of life, what you see.
So that's a lot. Definitely taking off the hat. I would have to say that, naturally anyone who's studied their history can get a little nervous when you start hearing the same actors start getting aggressive or making moves. It's definitely something as someone who enjoys space and wants to see how things progress, and my degrees in anthropology and political science. So these are things that I definitely think I'm watching, people are watching, the world is watching. We want to see how, as this grows and occurs, what would be the interactions. Would it just be the only people up on the moon who hate each other and don't want to be friends? Or will there be growth and cooperation if something does happen? Or I'd be lonely, so I'd want to check on my neighbors, ask for a cup of sugar. I don't know. So you never know how those types of things will work out, but it's definitely, it's hesitant. It makes you feel very hesitant that as we're beginning these talks and we're trying to be peaceful and go forward with this idea, that there may not be actors that agree with that. And so it's something to watch, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. And I tried really hard to make equal time for everybody. I hope I succeeded. Just to build on what you said, I think in this pandemic, we've really learned this concept of neighborness, right? Neighborliness and looking out for your neighbors. And I think it was a very healthy lesson for all of us, I hope, and not just the pandemic, obviously all of this civil unrest here. And I have to say, you know, there's a lot going on in the United States, but you know, the news seems to highlight all the bad, and there's just as much good, if not more. I'm going to just close out. I know, Bert, I'm going to run over just another minute or so before I turn it back to you, because there have been questions and there were questions submitted before about what courses would you recommend to take in school where you don't have a space law program. You will want to take any public international law courses, any international trade courses. You don't want to take administrative law because that's going to help you understand how regulations work in those regulatory agencies. There are an intense amount of career opportunities in the space law field. What's really important to remember about space law, though, is that everything we do on Earth, we're going to need to do in space. What we don't have a lot of jobs for just that, you know, I know the Outer Space Treaty like the back of my hand person. Okay, you need to bring other skills to space with you. So go and learn about labor law, and you know, and then we can protect the workers on those space hotels, right? Or you know, learn you know, tort law, and then you can do the slip and falls in those space hotels, and or learn contract law, because then you can read the launch licenses and the payload contracts and so forth. There's a lot of things that you can do in space without you know, but there's a lot of things you must be able to do in space beyond understanding the space law treaties. And just to wrap it up, though, I will say, and I tell all of my classes that everything that we do on Earth is affected by space somehow. And within this decade, if you don't know space law, then you are going to be malpracticing your clients as a lawyer, because you have not been able to think about your representation broadly enough. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, everybody. We will look at, I promise, the Q&A and the chats. Thank you to my brilliant students and I should say panelists. Sorry, I'm a mom. I'm really proud of you all. Thank you. Thanks, Bert.
There we go. Just getting everything. Michelle, it would be okay. We've got one hand that was raised, and it's from one of our chapter officers, and would be okay if he asked a question.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Carl, I'm going to allow you to talk. Carl, everyone might remember Carl. He typically asks one question at each of our space forums. So let's see. And Carl, your mic's open, but you're muted. You want to try to ask a question? Looks like you're still muted, Carl. I love technology. Nope, still muted. Well, we might.
Okay, here we are.
There you go, Carl. Okay.
I found it. I found the right button. Okay, my question. Considering preservation and conservation of whatever location we go to in order to organize a settlement, how does terraforming fit into this? Because in order to make it more habitable, since most, if not all of celestial bodies will be unlike Earth, how is it possible to maintain maximum levels of habitability, human habitability, if we don't terraform, and thereby changing the environment in that area?
So the prime directive, Carl, you can't ruin life. So I think the concept is we're not trying to stop anything when we talk about preservation. We just want to sort of stop and think, right? There are going to be, everything we do requires a balance. We shouldn't vector off to terraform every place, nor should we vector off to don't touch, you can't, right? And so what we're looking for, what young space lawyers are getting ready to do is to figure out those risks and balances and start the international community talking about things like human rights and preservation and conservation, because those are things that we need to think about no matter what we plan to do. And so there are going to be places where I believe we will terraform and it will make sense. And there are going to be other places where, it's just the balance is going to go the other way and we just shouldn't. But we really need to have those conversations.
And I think we got one more question that Larry wanted to ask. Larry?
Well, there's two things. Number one, let's do this again. This was fun. And I think the law, space law is going to be a real interesting stuff. One thing that you didn't talk about is when you look about what's happening in the world today, and I just want to give you one example. What about United States versus the world concerning gun carrying? It's legal for persons to do that in the United States, but almost everywhere else in the world, individuals can't do that. Out in space, you're not going to have, what was that movie, Outpost or something? You're not going to have gun-toting sheriffs and stuff like this versus outlaws.
Wow.
The movie, by the way, was Outland with Sean Connery.
Outland, that's right.
Yeah. This is AJ speaking. I'll take that because I have to jump off. I think simply there's a difference between state law and international law, right? So states have the right to make their own laws internally, but they do not have that same right internationally. So I do not think that American citizens will be able to just take their guns to space and use them as they do in the US.
Yes.
I don't think that's how it'll work.
That was just an example. There's other things that we do in America that would not work in the rest of the world. And the thing is, when you go to space, you're going to be very restricted what you can do. If you're on an American satellite, maybe, but if you're going to someplace else that is not American, you're going to find out. Especially some of these young people, when you travel overseas, you'll find out there's a big difference.
Very good. Thanks so much, Larry. Well, I also want to extend a thank you to our panelists, Christiana, AJ, Samuel, Laura, and Bailey. It was just a fascinating discussion. And to you, Michelle, for the great job in moderating and handling all those questions. The one thing that's always impressed me as we've been doing these town halls and space forums is the incredible knowledge of our members and the audience, whether it's spacecraft or rockets or propulsion or environmental issues or mining on the moon. We seem to have an audience that knows a lot. So I was always impressed with their technical knowledge. And now with all those questions that we saw, they also have a lot of knowledge of space law as well. So thank you all for all of your participation in all those questions. I did save everything and I will pass that on to Michelle so she can actually incorporate some of those questions into the next exam. So very good. But again, thank you all for a really great informative session. And as Larry says, we'd love to have you back as well. I'm sure there's a lot more to discuss. So everybody, I'm just going to share my screen again as we close out for tonight. And let me just put this back into slideshow. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. It was a lot of fun, very informative. And I do hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks when we have another panel of professionals, the next generation, as Larry liked to call them, who are involved in aerospace engineering and aerospace science and STEM education. So we're looking forward to another great discussion like we had this evening. So for all of you who attended, I want to thank you again. Have a great evening. For those of you who are in different time zones, have a great day. And of course, have a great weekend as well, since that's coming up. And stay safe, everybody. Thank you all. Wishing you all a good night.